In the dusty plains of West Texas, where hope withers like autumn grass, a lonely rancher's desperate gamble is about to change everything. Eli Mercer, weathered by 60 years of hard living and haunted by losses that carved deep furrows in his soul, sends his last silver dollars east for what he believes will be a young, practical bride to ease his solitude. Instead, the dusty stagecoach delivers Maeve Callahan, a woman whose silver hair catches the prairie light and whose steady gaze holds secrets of her own. She carries nothing but a worn leather satchel and a determination that matches the relentless Texas wind. What unfolds between these two weathered souls isn't the arrangement either expected, but something far more precious and dangerous. Can two people who have lived through heartbreak and buried their dreams find the courage to trust again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Texas horizon in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the Mercer ranch as Eli limped toward the barn. His right leg, shattered by Confederate grape shot 30 years past, ached with the promise of another scorching day. At 60, he moved with the deliberate gait of a man who had learned to work around his limitations, each step a testament to stubborn will over failing flesh. The ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of what had once been prime grazing land, though drought had turned much of it to dust and stubble. Cattle, lean and restless, clustered around the few remaining water holes, their ribs showing through hide that had lost its healthy sheen. The sight of them stirred familiar guilt in Eli's chest. Another responsibility. He was failing, another legacy crumbling under his watch. "Morning, boss," called out Jake Morrison, the ranch foreman whose graying beard and weathered hands spoke of 40 years spent under the Texas sun. Jake had been with the Mercer family since before the war, back when Eli's father ran the spread, and the future seemed as vast as the sky itself. Eli nodded, not trusting his voice this early in the day. Words had become precious commodities since Martha's death 15 years ago, and even more scarce after losing Thomas. His son's absence remained a raw wound that time refused to heal, a silence that filled every corner of the ranch house and followed him through his daily rounds. The barn held the familiar sense of hay, leather, and honest sweat. 3 other hands worked quietly, their movements efficient despite their advancing years. Cookie Williams, whose real name had been lost to time and circumstance, maintained the chuck wagon and kept the men fed on beans, hardtack, and whatever game they could catch. Pete Sanchez, a former vaquero whose rope skills were legendary throughout the county, mended tack with the patience of a man who understood that quality work lasted. And old Tom Fletcher, whose hearing had mostly gone but whose eyes could still spot a sick calf from half a mile away. These men had become Eli's only family, though he would never speak such sentiment aloud. They stayed not for the wages, which were often late and always modest, but for loyalty to the Mercer name and perhaps recognition of shared loneliness. None of them had wives waiting at home, children to carry on their names, or any other place that would welcome their aging bones. The ranch house itself stood as a monument to better days, its 2-story frame structure solid, but showing signs of neglect that Eli could no longer ignore. Paint peeled from the shutters, the front porch sagged slightly on one end, and the vegetable garden that Martha had lovingly tended had long since surrendered to weeds and drought. Inside, dust gathered in unused rooms, while Eli confined himself mostly to the kitchen, his bedroom, and the small office where bills and correspondence accumulated like autumn leaves. It was in that office, 3 months ago, that desperation had finally overcome pride. Surrounded by overdue notices and dwindling bank statements, Eli had found himself staring at a mail-order bride catalogue that had arrived with the other mail, probably meant for some other lonely soul in the territory. The pages were filled with proper-looking young women seeking practical arrangements with established men, their careful poses and written descriptions promising companionship, household management, and the possibility of children to carry on a man's legacy. The decision had not come easily. For weeks, the catalogue had remained buried under other papers, while Eli wrestled with his conscience and his pride. Marriage had been sacred with Martha union of love that had produced 15 years of happiness and their precious son. The idea of reducing it to a business transaction felt like betrayal of their memory. But the alternative was slow starvation of both body and spirit. The ranch required a woman's touch to become a home again, and Eli required purpose beyond mere survival. At 60, he had perhaps 10 or 15 good years left, and the prospect of spending them entirely alone seemed worse than any compromise with his principles. The young woman he had selected from the catalogue was named Rebecca Hartwell, 26 years old, from a farming family in Ohio. Her letter had been practical and forthright, speaking of her domestic skills, her willingness to work hard, and her understanding that their arrangement would be based on mutual benefit rather than romantic sentiment. She seemed perfect for his needs, young enough to bear children, experienced enough to manage a household, and realistic enough to accept the terms of their agreement. Eli had sent $200 nearly, the last of his cash reserves, along with a letter detailing the challenges of ranch life and his own limitations as a husband. He had been honest about his age, his injury, and his expectation that their relationship would begin as a partnership with the possibility of deeper affection growing over time. Rebecca's response had been prompt and encouraging, confirming her arrival date and expressing her readiness to begin their new life together. That had been 6 weeks ago. Today, if the stage was on schedule, Rebecca Hartwell would arrive to begin their carefully negotiated future. Eli had spent the morning trying to make the house presentable, sweeping floors that had not seen a woman's attention in years, and attempting to bring order to rooms that had become repositories for his accumulated solitude. The irony was not lost on him that he was preparing for companionship with all the enthusiasm of a man facing surgery. Love, he had learned, was not something that could be ordered from a catalogue or negotiated through correspondence. But perhaps, at his age, companionship and mutual respect would prove sufficient foundation for whatever years remained to him. As he made his final preparations, checking his pocket watch and adjusting his best shirt, Eli allowed himself to hope that Rebecca Hartwell would find the ranch acceptable and his company tolerable. The alternative, continued isolation until age or illness finally claimed him, seemed too bleak to contemplate. The stage would arrive within the hour, carrying with it the possibility of renewal or the confirmation of his worst fears about the choices that desperation could drive a man to make. Either way, after today, the Mercer Ranch would never be quite the same again. In his desk drawer, carefully wrapped in faded cloth, lay his old war medal, a piece of bronze and ribbon that represented both honor and the price of survival. He had not looked at it in years, could not bear the weight of what it represented. Today, as he prepared to meet his mail-order bride, he wondered if courage came in different forms at different stages of life, and whether the bravery required to open one's heart again might prove more challenging than anything he had faced on the battlefield. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon at precisely 2 o'clock, announcing the arrival of the weekly stage from San Antonio. Eli positioned himself on the front porch, his weight shifted to his good leg, watching as the familiar conveyance bounced and swayed across the rutted road that led to his ranch. His hands, despite his efforts to appear calm, trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar one final time. Jake Morrison emerged from the barn, drawn by the sound of approaching horses and the unusual sight of his boss, waiting in full view like a man expecting company. The foreman's weathered face showed carefully controlled curiosity. Eli had mentioned expecting a visitor, but had provided no details about the nature of this arrival. The stage driver, a grizzled man named Harlan, who had been running this route for the better part of 2 decades, pulled the team to a halt with a flourish of dust and jingling harness. He climbed down from his perch with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints protested every jarring mile of his profession. "Afternoon, Eli," Harlan called out, tipping his hat with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "Got a passenger for you today. Lady says she's expected." Eli's heart hammered against his ribs as the stage door opened. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind dozens of times, imagining how he would greet Rebecca Hartwell with appropriate courtesy while maintaining the dignified reserve befitting their business arrangement. He had prepared words of welcome, gestures of assistance, and expressions of hope for their mutual satisfaction with the agreement they had struck. What emerged from the dusty interior of the stagecoach bore no resemblance to his carefully constructed expectations. The woman who stepped down onto the hard-packed earth was not 26, but closer to his own age, her silver-streaked hair pinned back in a practical style that spoke of years spent managing classrooms rather than seeking husbands. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, worn but well-maintained, and carried herself with the straight-backed dignity of someone accustomed to authority. Her face, lined by sun and time but still handsome, held intelligent grey eyes that took in the ranch, the house, and Eli himself with the measuring gaze of a woman who had learned to assess situations quickly and thoroughly. "Mr. Mercer?" she asked, her voice carrying the cultured tones of education and the slight weariness of long travel. "I am Maeve Callahan." The name hit Eli like a physical blow. Not Rebecca Hartwell, not the young woman whose practical letters had convinced him that a marriage of convenience might prove workable, but a complete stranger whose very presence represented the collapse of his carefully laid plans. "There's been some mistake," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "I was expecting—" "Rebecca Hartwell," Maeve finished, reaching into her traveling bag to withdraw a folded document. "Yes, I imagine you were. I'm afraid my niece took it upon herself to arrange this meeting without consulting me fully about the details of your correspondence." She handed him the paper, which proved to be a teaching certificate from the Austin public school system issued to Maeve Callahan and dated 3 years prior. The document was carefully preserved, but showed signs of frequent handling, as if its owner had occasion to prove her credentials regularly. "Your niece?" Eli repeated, struggling to make sense of this unexpected turn. "Rebecca is my sister's child," Maeve explained, her tone suggesting this was not the first time she had been required to clarify her family's complicated arrangements. "She has been staying with me in Austin while seeking employment as a governess. When your letters arrived, she took it upon herself to respond on my behalf, apparently believing that my recent widowhood and reduced circumstances made me a suitable candidate for your proposition." The stage driver cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence and his schedule. "Ma'am, I need to know if you're staying or heading back to town with me. Got other stops to make before dark." Maeve straightened her shoulders, a gesture that somehow conveyed both determination and vulnerability. "That remains to be determined, Mr. Harlan, ma'am. Been driving this route since before you were born, I'd wager. Mr. Harlan, perhaps you could give Mr. Mercer and me a few minutes to discuss the situation." Eli found his voice, though it came out sharper than he intended. "There's nothing to discuss. This has all been a mistake. I'll pay your fare back to town and we can pretend none of this happened." "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple," Maeve replied, her grey eyes meeting his with steady resolve. "You see, I gave up my boarding house room in Austin when I accepted this position. My belongings are currently in storage, and I have exactly $14 to my name until I can secure new employment." The admission hung between them like a challenge, neither plea nor demand, but simply a statement of fact delivered with the dignity of someone who had learned to face adversity without flinching. Jake Morrison, who had been listening from a respectful distance, stepped forward. "Boss, maybe the lady would like some water and a chance to rest before making any decisions. Been a long, dusty ride from town." Eli shot his foreman a look that promised later conversation, but Jake's suggestion carried the weight of basic hospitality that even his current confusion could not override. "Of course. Please, Mrs. Callahan, come inside. We can discuss your situation properly." As they walked toward the house, Maeve's gaze took in details that escaped most visitors: the peeling paint on the shutters, the sagging porch step, the neglected vegetable garden that showed signs of once having been carefully tended. Her expression revealed nothing, but Eli had the uncomfortable feeling that she was cataloguing problems with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to identifying what needed fixing. The interior of the house, despite his morning's efforts, could not hide years of bachelor neglect. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through windows that had not been properly cleaned in months. The parlor, unused since Martha's death, held the musty smell of rooms where life had ceased to flow. Maeve accepted his offer of a chair and a glass of water, with the gracious manner of a woman making a social call rather than someone whose future had just been thrown into uncertainty. She sipped the water slowly, giving them both time to adjust to this unexpected situation. "Your niece," Eli finally said, settling into the chair across from her with careful attention to his injured leg. "What exactly did she tell you about my letters?" "Very little, I'm afraid. Rebecca has always had a romantic disposition and a tendency to act first and explain later. She presented your correspondence as an opportunity for me to begin a new chapter of my life, as she put it. I understood that you were seeking a housekeeper and companion, someone to help manage your household while you focused on ranch operations." "A housekeeper and companion," Eli repeated, tasting the words. They carried none of the legal weight of wife, but somehow seemed less calculated than mail-order bride. "I realize now that Rebecca may have misrepresented the nature of your requirements," Maeve continued. "But I find myself in the position of needing employment, and you appear to have a household that could benefit from a woman's attention. Perhaps we might find some mutually beneficial arrangement, despite the unusual circumstances of my arrival." Eli studied her face, looking for signs of desperation or calculation, but finding only the calm assessment of a woman accustomed to making the best of difficult situations. "Callahan, I should be honest with you about what I was seeking. I sent that money for a wife, not an employee." "I understand, and I should be equally honest with you. I have no intention of marrying again. My husband was a good man, and our marriage was a happy one. I will not dishonor his memory by entering into an arrangement based solely on financial necessity." The directness of her refusal should have simplified matters, but instead it left Eli in an awkward position. He had paid $200 for a bride who would never arrive, and in her place sat a woman whose presence somehow made his empty house feel less tomb-like, despite their brief acquaintance. "However," Maeve continued, reaching into her bag to withdraw a small notebook, "I notice that your ranch operations might benefit from someone with experience in organization and education. I spent 15 years managing a household and 20 years teaching school. I can balance accounts, handle correspondence, and I suspect your ranch hands might profit from basic literacy instruction during the winter months when outside work is limited." She opened the notebook to reveal neat columns of figures and observations made during her short time on the property. "If you would be willing to provide room and board, plus a modest wage, I could offer my services until spring. By then, I should have saved enough to establish myself elsewhere, and you would have time to make more suitable arrangements for your long-term needs." The proposal was sensible, practical, and completely at odds with everything Eli had planned. Yet as he sat in his dusty parlor, listening to this silver-haired woman discuss his affairs with more clarity than he had managed in months, he found himself considering possibilities he had not imagined. Outside, Harlan cleared his throat meaningfully, reminding them that daylight was burning and he had a schedule to keep. The moment of decision had arrived, carrying with it consequences that neither of them could fully anticipate. Eli found himself nodding before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. "1 season," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man committing to something he did not entirely understand. "Room and board, and $20 a month until spring." Maeve's relief was carefully controlled but unmistakable. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. I believe we will both find this arrangement satisfactory." Harlan received his fare for the return trip with a knowing grin that suggested he had witnessed similar negotiations before. As the stage disappeared into its own dust cloud, Eli realized he was alone with a woman whose presence had already begun to alter the familiar rhythms of his solitary existence. "I'll show you to your room," he said, leading her up the narrow staircase to the second floor. The guest bedroom had been Martha's sewing room, converted hastily that morning with clean sheets and a wash basin. Sunlight filtered through curtains that showed their age but had been freshly aired. Maeve set her carpet bag on the simple wooden chair and surveyed the space with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to making any quarters comfortable. "This will do very well. If you could show me to your office, I'd like to examine your accounts before supper." Eli hesitated at the threshold of his private domain. The office held 15 years of accumulated paperwork, grief, and neglect. Allowing another person into that chaos felt like inviting scrutiny of his failures as both rancher and man. "It's not fit for a lady's eyes," he admitted. "I've let things slide since my wife passed." "Mr. Mercer," Maeve said gently, "I have spent the last 20 years teaching children whose greatest ambition was to avoid learning anything useful. I doubt your bookkeeping could prove more challenging than 8th grade arithmetic taught to boys who would rather be fishing." Her small smile carried enough warmth to ease his embarrassment. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you." The office proved every bit as chaotic as Eli had feared. Papers covered every surface in seemingly random piles, some dating back years. Correspondence lay opened and abandoned, bills mixed with personal letters and official documents in a testament to organizational paralysis. The ledger books that should have contained careful records of ranch finances were either missing pages or filled with entries that trailed off mid-sentence. Maeve stood in the doorway for a long moment, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Then she rolled up her sleeves with the determination of a general surveying a battlefield. "Do you have any system for these papers?" she asked, lifting a stack of invoices mixed with bank statements and what appeared to be a letter from his sister in California. "Not really," Eli admitted. "I used to keep things in order, but after Thomas died, I couldn't seem to—" He stopped, unwilling to complete the thought that would reveal how completely grief had derailed his ability to function. "I understand," Maeve said simply. "Grief has its own timeline, and organization is often its first casualty. We'll sort this out together." The "we" in her statement carried implications that made Eli uncomfortable. He had not asked for partnership, merely employed a housekeeper. Yet as Maeve began creating neat piles on the floor bills in one stack, correspondence in another, legal documents in a third, he found himself drawn into the process, despite his reservations. "This mortgage payment was due 6 months ago," she observed, holding up a notice that had somehow migrated to the bottom of a pile. "Have you been making payments?" "When I can," Eli replied, heat rising in his cheeks. "The bank's been patient because they know the Mercer name." "Patience has limits," Maeve said practically. "How many head of cattle do you currently run?" The question launched them into a discussion of ranch operations that revealed the extent of Eli's financial predicament. Drought had reduced his herd by 30% over the past 2 years. Feed costs had risen, while beef prices remained depressed. Several of his best grazing sections were mortgaged, and the interest payments consumed most of his modest profits. "You're not losing money," Maeve concluded after reviewing his rough figures. "But you're not making enough to sustain operations long-term. Every drought year or market downturn puts you closer to losing everything." Her assessment stung because it was accurate. Eli had been avoiding these truths for months, handling each crisis as it arose without confronting the larger pattern of decline. "The hands," he said defensively, "Jake, Cookie, Pete, and Tom have been with me for years. I can't just let them go." "I'm not suggesting you should," Maeve replied. "But a rancher who employs 4 men should be generating enough profit to support them properly. Either your operation needs to become more efficient, or you need to find additional sources of income." As the afternoon progressed, Maeve's organizational efforts revealed the ranch's situation with uncomfortable clarity. She created lists of creditors, schedules of payments, and inventories of assets, with the methodical approach of someone accustomed to bringing order to chaos. "You have excellent grazing land," she noted, consulting a hand-drawn map she had found buried under other papers. "The location provides good access to water and transportation. The problem appears to be management rather than resources." Eli bristled at the implied criticism. "I've been running this ranch since before you ever set foot in Texas. And successfully, I'm sure," Maeve replied without taking offense. "But circumstances change. Drought, markets, competition. Successful ranchers adapt their methods to meet new challenges." Her calm reasonableness made anger impossible to sustain. Instead, Eli found himself explaining the decisions that had led to his current predicament, the investments in breeding stock that had failed to pay off, the improvements to facilities that had stretched his budget, the refusal to reduce his workforce despite declining profits. "You've been thinking like a man with unlimited time and resources," Maeve observed. "But at 60, with a mortgage and creditors, you need to think strategically about the next 5 to 10 years. As evening approached, Cookie rang the dinner bell from the bunkhouse, his traditional signal that supper was ready for anyone hungry enough to brave his cooking. Eli realized that for the first time in months, he had been so absorbed in conversation that he had forgotten his usual late-afternoon melancholy. "The hands will want to meet you properly," he said, suddenly conscious that Maeve's presence would require adjustments to their established routines. "They're good men, but they're not used to having a lady around. I taught school for 20 years, Mr. Mercer. I'm quite accustomed to civilizing rough characters." As they walked toward the bunkhouse, Eli noticed that Maeve's gaze continued to catalogue details, the condition of the outbuildings, the state of the corrals, the worn but serviceable equipment that spoke of careful maintenance despite financial constraints. Her observations were not critical but analytical, the assessment of someone trying to understand how all the pieces fit together. The ranch hands had cleaned up for supper with the courtesy due a lady's presence. Jake had even convinced Tom Fletcher to comb his wild hair, though the effort had achieved only marginal improvement. They stood when Maeve entered, awkward but well-intentioned in their attempts at proper manners. "Boys," Eli said, using the term that had applied to these men for decades despite their advancing years. "This is Mrs. Callahan. She'll be helping with the books and household matters through the winter." The introductions proceeded with careful formality. Cookie offered his best attempt at refined cooking beans with actual seasoning and cornbread that had not been burned. Pete managed a few words in English rather than his usual Spanish. Tom Fletcher nodded repeatedly and smiled, probably understanding less than half of what was said, but determined to appear welcoming. It was Jake who finally asked the question that had been hanging unspoken in the air since Maeve's arrival. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what brings a schoolteacher to a cattle ranch?" Maeve's answer was diplomatic but honest. "Sometimes life requires us to adapt to unexpected circumstances, Mr. Morrison. I find myself in need of employment, and Mr. Mercer has graciously offered me the opportunity to put my skills to good use." The explanation satisfied their curiosity without revealing the embarrassing details of mail-order brides and family interference. As the meal progressed, Eli watched his men respond to Maeve's genuine interest in their work and their lives. She asked intelligent questions about ranch operations, listened carefully to their answers, and treated them with the respect due experienced professionals rather than hired labor. By the time they returned to the house, full darkness had settled over the ranch. Maeve lit the oil lamp in the office and resumed her sorting with the determination of someone who intended to finish what she had started. "You don't need to work tonight," Eli said. "This mess took years to create. It can wait another day." "Perhaps," Maeve replied, not looking up from the papers she was organizing. "But I prefer to understand the full scope of a problem before attempting solutions. Knowledge reduces anxiety, in my experience." Eli found himself lingering in the doorway, reluctant to return to his solitary evening routine. For the first time in years, the house felt inhabited rather than merely occupied, animated by another person's presence and purpose. 3 days into Maeve's residency, the ranch had begun to show signs of feminine influence that surprised Eli with their subtle power. Clean curtains appeared at the kitchen windows. The perpetual layer of dust vanished from surfaces, and meals arrived at regular intervals, rather than whenever Cookie remembered to ring his bell. More striking was Maeve's effect on the ranch hands. She had proposed teaching them to read during the evening hours, using old newspapers and ranch supply catalogs as textbooks. The suggestion had been met with skepticism from men who had survived decades without formal education, but curiosity had gradually overcome resistance. Mrs. Callahan, Pete Sanchez said during their first lesson, struggling with an advertisement for horse liniment, why this word guaranteed got so many letters if it just mean promise. Because English borrowed it from French. Maeve explained patiently, using the blackboard she had improvised from a piece of slate. Many of our longest words come from other languages, which is why they seem unnecessarily complicated. Tom Fletcher, whose hearing loss made group instruction challenging, proved surprisingly adept at reading once Maeve provided him with written materials. His pride in successfully working through a paragraph about cattle breeding techniques was evident to everyone present. Even Cookie, who claimed his eyes were too old for book learning, had begun asking Maeve to help him read recipes from a cookbook that had belonged to his long-dead mother. The sight of the gruff cook carefully copying instructions for apple pie, his weather-beaten hands forming letters with childlike concentration, stirred something in Eli that he was reluctant to examine too closely. But it was while organizing the ranch's administrative chaos that Maeve made her most unsettling discovery. Hidden beneath a stack of correspondence dating back several years, she found a small wooden toy horse, carved with the crude but loving skill of a father's hands. Eli entered the office to find her holding the toy with careful reverence, her expression soft with understanding. The sight of it in another person's hands hit him like a physical blow, awakening grief that he had thought safely buried. Thomas made that, he said, his voice rough with emotion he could not control. He was 8 years old, proud as anything when he finished it. Said he was going to make a whole herd of horses, maybe some cattle too. Maeve set the toy gently on the desk, her grey eyes reflecting the kind of compassion that came from personal experience with loss. He sounds like he was a remarkable boy. He was. The words came out broken, carrying 15 years of accumulated sorrow. Fever took him that winter. One day he was playing with that horse, making up stories about cattle drives and adventures. 3 days later he was gone. The tears came without warning, 15 years of suppressed grief breaking through the barriers that Eli had constructed around his heart. He had not cried since the day they buried Thomas, had not allowed himself the luxury of mourning because survival had required all his strength. Maeve said nothing, but her presence filled the silence with understanding rather than judgment. When the storm of emotion finally passed, she handed him a clean handkerchief without comment, allowing him to compose himself with dignity intact. Martha blamed me, Eli continued, needing somehow to complete the story now that it had begun. Said if I hadn't been so focused on the ranch, maybe I would have noticed the signs earlier, gotten the doctor sooner. She was probably right. Grief makes us cruel to ourselves and others, Maeve said quietly. I said terrible things to my husband during his final illness, blamed him for getting sick, for leaving me alone, for not fighting harder to stay. Guilt is grief's cruelest companion. Her admission created a bridge of shared experience that made Eli's confession feel less like weakness. Martha never forgave me. We lived in the same house for 7 more years, but she never forgave me. When she died, I almost felt relieved, and then I hated myself for feeling that way. Thomas would be 23 now. Maeve observed, gently redirecting his focus toward what might have been rather than dwelling on loss. What do you think he would have made of the ranch? Would he have wanted to continue your work? The question surprised Eli with its forward-looking perspective. For 15 years, he had thought of Thomas only as the 8-year-old boy who had died, never imagining him as the man he might have become. He loved the cattle, Eli said slowly, the memory bringing a smile despite his tears. Used to follow me around, asking questions about everything. Why did we brand them? How did we know which ones were healthy? He had plans to improve the bloodlines, breed better stock. Then perhaps the best way to honor his memory would be to continue that work. Maeve suggested. To build the ranch he dreamed of, even if he can't be here to see it. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Eli had revealed his deepest wound, and Maeve had responded not with pity, but with practical wisdom that acknowledged both loss and possibility. The wooden horse remained on the desk where she had placed it, no longer hidden but not quite restored to prominence either. Over the following days, their evening work sessions developed a comfortable rhythm. Maeve would organize papers and update ledgers, while Eli reviewed her recommendations and explained the historical context behind various decisions. Their conversations ranged from immediate practical concerns to larger questions about the ranch's future direction. Your breeding program shows promise, Maeve noted, reviewing records of cattle purchases and sales. But you're not documenting bloodlines consistently. A buyer wants to know exactly what he's purchasing. Thomas was going to help me with that, Eli admitted. He had a head for details, could remember every cow's lineage better than I could write it down. Then we'll create the system he would have wanted, Maeve replied matter-of-factly. Proper records will allow you to charge premium prices for quality stock. Her assumption that they would work together beyond the immediate crisis of organizing his affairs had become so natural that Eli barely noticed it. Maeve spoke of spring plans and long-term improvements as if her temporary employment had already extended into permanent partnership. The drought that had plagued the region for 2 years showed no signs of breaking. Water sources that had sustained the ranch for generations were reduced to muddy pools. Cattle clustered around the remaining wells, their condition deteriorating despite the hand's best efforts to find adequate grazing. It was during one of these difficult periods that rustlers struck, taking advantage of scattered herds and overextended resources. Jake discovered the theft during his morning rounds, finding clear evidence that someone had driven off nearly 30 head during the night. Professional job, Jake reported grimly. They knew exactly which section to hit, took the best breeding stock, and covered their tracks like men who've done this before. Eli's first instinct was to ride out with his men, track the thieves, and recover his property through direct confrontation. It was the response of a younger man accustomed to solving problems through decisive action. Maeve's reaction was characteristically different. "Have you reported this to the sheriff?" she asked. "Sheriff Hawkins is 60 miles away and probably wouldn't arrive before the trail goes cold," Eli replied. "We handle our own problems out here." "And how has that approach worked for your neighbors?" Maeve inquired. "Are rustlers a recurring problem in this area?" Her questions forced Eli to acknowledge that cattle theft had become increasingly common throughout the region. Several smaller ranchers had been driven out of business by persistent losses, their herds picked apart by organized thieves who operated with apparent impunity. "Maybe it's time to try a different approach," Maeve suggested. "What if the ranchers worked together instead of handling each incident separately?" The idea of cooperation with his neighbors struck Eli as both logical and foreign. His natural inclination was towards self-reliance, the independence that had sustained him through war, grief, and financial hardship. But as Maeve pointed out, self-reliance had also contributed to his current isolation and vulnerability. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over drought-stricken landscape, Eli found himself contemplating changes that extended far beyond bookkeeping and household management. Maeve's presence had introduced new perspectives on problems he had always approached alone, possibilities he had never considered because his grief had narrowed his vision to mere survival. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, breaking a comfortable silence, "when you agreed to stay until spring, what did you envision happening then?" Maeve was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I suppose I thought I would have figured out what comes next by then. At 58, starting over requires more courage than I sometimes feel I possess." Her admission of uncertainty humanized her in ways that her competence had not. Eli realized that beneath her practical exterior, Maeve was as uncertain about the future as he was, as affected by life's unexpected turns as any person facing the unknown. "Maybe," he said carefully, "we could figure it out together." October brought cooler evenings, and the first hint that the merciless summer heat might eventually break. Eli and Maeve had settled into routines that felt remarkably natural for two people who had known each other less than 2 months. Their evening work sessions had expanded beyond bookkeeping to include wide-ranging conversations about everything from ranch management to memories of their respective marriages. It was Maeve who finally forced the issue by proposing to visit the Henderson Ranch herself if Eli wouldn't make the first move. The thought of her traveling alone across territory where rustlers operated freely was enough to overcome his resistance. "I'll go," he said quickly, "but I'm not making any promises about what I'll agree to." The visit to the Henderson Ranch proved illuminating in ways Eli had not anticipated. Frank Henderson, a man roughly his own age who had been struggling with similar problems, welcomed him with the relief of someone who had been hoping for exactly this conversation. "Been thinking we needed to talk," Frank admitted over coffee in his kitchen. "These thieves aren't random opportunists. They know our routines, our weak spots, probably been watching us for months." The discussion that followed revealed the scope of the problem. Nearly every ranch in a 30-mile radius had suffered losses, but no one had been comparing notes or coordinating responses. The thieves had been able to operate with impunity because their victims were too proud or too isolated to seek help. "My wife keeps saying we should move to town," Frank continued. "Open a store or something safer, but this land has been in my family for 20 years. I don't want to be the generation that gives up." His sentiment echoed Eli's own feelings about the Mercer Ranch. Despite all his struggles, the idea of abandoning the spread felt like betraying not just Thomas's memory, but the entire legacy his family had built. By the time Eli returned home, plans for coordinated patrols and shared intelligence had been established. More importantly, he had rediscovered the value of community connections that his grief had caused him to neglect. "How did it go?" Maeve asked, looking up from the ledger she had been updating. "Better than expected," Eli admitted. "Frank Henderson's a good man, and he's as tired of running scared as I am. We're going to try working together, see if we can't make life harder for these rustlers." "And how do you feel about that decision?" The question was characteristic of Maeve's approach to difficult topics, direct but gentle, focused on emotional rather than purely practical considerations. Eli had learned that her inquiries usually led to insights he might not reach on his own. "Nervous," he said honestly. "It's been a long time since I relied on anyone besides myself and the boys. But also relieved, I think. Some problems are too big for one person to solve alone." That evening, as they sat before the fire with Eli playing a slow, contemplative melody on his fiddle, both of them recognized that their relationship had evolved far beyond the employer-employee arrangement they had originally negotiated. They had become partners in ways that neither had anticipated, their individual strengths combining to address challenges that had seemed insurmountable when faced alone. But with deeper connection came complications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Maeve's presence had transformed the ranch from a lonely outpost into something approaching a home, but her employment was still scheduled to end with spring's arrival. And beneath their growing friendship lay undercurrents of attraction and affection that complicated the clear boundaries they had initially established. As winter approached and the nights grew longer, both Eli and Maeve found themselves wondering what would happen when the season of their agreement finally ended. It was during one of these conversations that Maeve made a discovery that would change her understanding of the man she had agreed to help. While organizing a trunk of personal items that Eli had avoided opening for years, she found an old fiddle wrapped in faded cloth. "You're a musician," she said, not quite a question, but clearly seeking confirmation. Eli's face closed off immediately, the openness that had developed between them disappearing behind familiar walls of grief and self-protection. Haven't touched that thing in 15 years. "May I?" Maeve asked, her hands hovering respectfully near the instrument. After a moment's hesitation, Eli nodded. Maeve lifted the fiddle with the reverence due a sacred object, examining its worn but well-maintained wood. "It's beautiful, The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Made it myself, Eli admitted reluctantly. Took me 3 winters to get it right. Thomas used to love hearing me play, said the music made the house feel alive. What happened to the music when Thomas died? The question hung in the air between them, gentle but insistent. Eli looked out the window at gathering dusk, his jaw working as he struggled with memories that were apparently still too painful to examine directly. Martha said she couldn't bear to hear it anymore, he finally answered. Said it reminded her too much of what we'd lost, so I put it away and never took it out again. Maeve set the fiddle carefully back in its wrapping, but her expression suggested the conversation was far from over. Music isn't just entertainment, Mr. Mercer. It's how we process emotions too complex for words. When you stopped playing, you also stopped grieving properly. I grieved plenty, Eli said defensively. You suffered. That's different from grieving. Grief requires we honor what we've lost, not bury it so deeply that we forget why it mattered. Her words carried the authority of someone who had walked through her own valley of loss and emerged with hard-won wisdom. Over the following days, the fiddle's presence in the room seemed to charge the air with possibility and regret in equal measure. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during an evening when autumn's first real cold snap had driven them to build a fire in the parlor. Maeve was mending one of Eli's shirts, a domestic task she had taken on without being asked, when she began humming a melody that Eli recognized from his childhood. My mother used to sing that song, he said softly. The water is wide, Maeve confirmed. My husband loved it, said it reminded him that some distances can only be crossed by faith. Without conscious decision, Eli found himself reaching for the fiddle. His fingers, stiff from years of disuse, struggled with the tuning pegs, but muscle memory gradually returned. The first tentative notes were rough, uncertain, but the melody was there, waiting beneath the rust of neglect. As he played, years of suppressed emotion flowed through the music. Not just grief for Thomas and Martha, but older sorrow's comrades lost in the war, his parents' deaths, the accumulated weight of a lifetime's worth of partings and disappointments. But also joy, carefully preserved beneath the pain memories of Thomas laughing at his father's musical mistakes, Martha singing along while she worked in the kitchen, the simple pleasure of creating beauty in a harsh world. When the song ended, both Eli and Maeve had tears in their eyes, but these were different from the tears that had accompanied his earlier breakdown. These carried healing rather than pure sorrow, acknowledgement rather than denial. Thomas would want you to keep playing, Maeve said quietly. I know, Eli replied, cradling the fiddle against his chest. I think I'm finally ready to let him go, which means I'm finally ready to remember him properly. The music marked another milestone in their deepening relationship. Over the following weeks, evening sessions often concluded with Eli playing tunes he remembered from his youth, while Maeve listened with the appreciation of someone who understood both the technical skill and emotional courage required. But their growing closeness was complicated by external pressures that reminded them of the temporary nature of their arrangement. The rustling problem had worsened, with 3 more ranches in the area reporting significant losses. Sheriff Hawkins had finally made an appearance, but his investigation yielded little beyond confirmation that the thieves were well organized and probably had inside knowledge of local operations. More troubling was the discovery that several smaller ranchers were considering selling out rather than continuing to fight thieves, drought, and declining profits. If that trend continued, the character of the entire region would change, with large corporate operations replacing the family ranches that had defined the area's culture for generations. We need to organize, Maeve insisted during one of their strategy sessions. Individual ranchers are easy targets, but a coordinated response could make theft unprofitable. Eli remained skeptical about cooperation with neighbors he had barely spoken to in years. His natural inclination toward independence warred with growing recognition that isolation had made him vulnerable in ways that extended beyond criminal activity. The Hendersons have been good neighbors, he admitted, referring to the family that ran the spread adjacent to his. And Jim Morrison, Jake's brother, might be willing to coordinate patrols if we approached him right. Then let's approach him, Maeve said practically. What's the worst that could happen? They say no, and you're no worse off than you are now. Her logic was unassailable, but Eli found himself hesitating for reasons that had little to do with practical concerns. Reaching out to neighbors would require admitting that he needed help, acknowledging that his years of self-imposed isolation had been a mistake. Pride, it seemed, was a harder enemy to defeat than rustlers or drought. November brought the first killing frost, and with it a discovery that would change everything Maeve understood about the life she was helping to rebuild. While organizing materials in Thomas's old rumor space, Eli had finally agreed to convert into a proper office. She found a small wooden box containing her son's treasured possessions. Among the carefully preserved items was a pressed wildflower, its purple petals still retaining traces of their original color, despite 15 years of careful storage. A note, in a child's careful handwriting, identified it as Indian paintbrush from the creek for Mama's garden. He collected flowers for Martha, Eli explained when Maeve showed him the discovery. Every spring, he'd bring her bouquets from his walks around the ranch. She pressed the special ones in her Bible, said they were too beautiful to let fade completely. Maeve held the delicate specimen up to the lamplight, marveling at how something so fragile had survived when stronger things had perished. "Where is Martha's Bible now?" Eli's expression grew distant. "Buried with her. I thought she'd want to take her flowers with her." "But Thomas meant for them to bring life and beauty to this world," Maeve observed gently. "Perhaps preserving them properly would honor both their memories." Over the following days, Maeve began a project that seemed to heal something in the ranch's wounded atmosphere. Using techniques she had learned from her own mother, she carefully restored the flower and created a frame that would preserve it permanently. But more than that, she began encouraging Eli to share stories about the life that had once filled these rooms with laughter and love. "Tell me about Thomas's walks," she would say as they worked together in the evenings. "What did he see that adults missed?" Gradually, Eli found himself remembering details he had buried along with his grief. Thomas's fascination with the hawks that nested in the cottonwoods along the creek. His determination to map every corner of the ranch, creating childish but detailed drawings of landmarks and animal habitats. His plans to build a treehouse where he could watch for cattle rustlers and wild horses. "He had such imagination," Eli said, smiling at memories that no longer carried only pain. "Used to tell me stories about the adventures he'd have when he was old enough to ride the range by himself. Cowboys and Indians, cattle drives to mysterious destinations, buried treasure hidden in the hills. He sounds like he inherited his father's storytelling ability," Maeve observed, referring to the tales Eli had begun sharing during their evening conversations. As winter settled in earnest, the coordinated patrols with neighboring ranchers began to show results. The organized approach had disrupted the rustlers' operations, forcing them to seek easier targets elsewhere. But success came with its own complications, as reports arrived of increased activity in counties to the south and west. "We've just moved the problem," Frank Henderson observed during one of their regular meetings at the Mercer Ranch. "These thieves are like wolves, they'll keep hunting until someone stops them permanently." The conversation that followed revealed the scope of the criminal organization they were fighting. Evidence suggested a network of thieves, buyers, and corrupt officials that extended across multiple counties. Individual ranchers working together had been effective at local protection, but dismantling the entire operation would require resources and authority they did not possess. It was Maeve who suggested involving the territorial government, writing letters to officials in Austin who might have the power to coordinate a broader response. Her experience with bureaucracy and formal correspondence proved invaluable in crafting appeals that would be taken seriously by distant officials. "You have a gift for this," Eli told her as she drafted yet another carefully worded request for assistance. "Making complex situations clear, finding the right words to convince people to act." 20 years of writing reports for school superintendents," Maeve replied with a slight smile. You learn to present facts in ways that motivate action rather than just document problems. But their success in addressing external threats was shadowed by growing awareness of internal complications that neither was quite ready to confront directly. As winter nights grew longer and their evening conversations more intimate, both Eli and Maeve found themselves navigating feelings that transcended their original practical arrangement. The turning point came during a December blizzard that trapped them together in the ranch house for 3 days. With the hands safely ensconced in the bunkhouse and no possibility of outside contact, Eli and Maeve experienced a kind of domestic intimacy that revealed how completely their lives had become intertwined. They cooked together, Maeve teaching Eli techniques she had learned from her grandmother, while he shared knowledge of preserving meat and making do with limited supplies. They read aloud to each other, from books found in Martha's collection, discovering shared appreciation for poetry and novels that transported them far from the isolated ranch. Most significantly, they talked with the honesty that comes when people realize they have moved beyond social conventions into genuine friendship. Maeve spoke of her marriage to Robert, a kind but unimaginative man who had provided security but little intellectual stimulation. Eli described his courtship of Martha, a whirlwind romance that had produced 15 years of happiness, followed by 7 years of gradual estrangement. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had met when we were younger?" Maeve asked during one of these conversations, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the windows. "I try not to think about what might have been," Eli replied carefully. "But I find myself grateful that we met when we did, even under such strange circumstances." The admission hung between them, acknowledging feelings that had developed despite their efforts to maintain proper boundaries. Both recognized that their relationship had evolved far beyond the temporary employment agreement that had brought them together. When the storm finally passed and normal routines resumed, both Eli and Maeve found themselves acutely aware that spring and the end of their agreed arrangement was only a few months away. The approaching deadline forced them to confront questions they had been avoiding about what would happen when the season of their partnership officially ended. The ranch was thriving under their combined management. The books were in order, the men were happier and more productive, and the coordinated anti-rustling efforts had restored a sense of security to the entire region. But success had created its own dilemma. Would Maeve really leave just when everything they had built together was beginning to flourish? More troubling was the recognition that their personal connection had deepened into something that resembled love, even though neither was quite ready to use that word. They had found in each other the companionship and understanding that both had thought lost forever, but the temporary nature of their arrangement had prevented them from acknowledging these feelings openly. As January arrived with news that territorial officials were finally taking action against the rustling network, Eli and Maeve faced the reality that external problems were being solved, just as internal complications were becoming impossible to ignore. The discovery that would change everything came on a bitter February morning when Maeve was conducting her final review of the ranch's legal documents. Buried beneath years of accumulated correspondence, she found a deed that made her blood run cold with its implications. The document, dated 18 months earlier, purported to transfer ownership of the ranch's most valuable water rights to a corporation called Lone Star Land Development. Eli's signature appeared at the bottom, witnessed and notarized according to legal requirements. But as Maeve studied the paperwork with the careful attention of someone trained to spot forgeries in student work, she realized that something was fundamentally wrong. "Mr. Mercer," she called, her voice tight with controlled alarm. "Could you come here, please?" Eli entered the office to find Maeve holding the deed with hands that trembled slightly. Her face had gone pale, and her usual composure showed cracks that suggested she had discovered something far worse than a simple bookkeeping error. "Do you recognize this document?" she asked, extending the paper toward him. Eli took the deed and examined it with growing confusion. "I never signed this," he said flatly. "Never even heard of Lone Star Land Development. What is this supposed to be?" "According to this paperwork, You sold your water rights to them for $5,000 18 months ago. The signature looks authentic, the notarization appears legitimate, and the filing date places it during a period when you were dealing with multiple financial crises. The implications hit Eli like a physical blow. Water rights were the foundation of any successful ranch operation in Texas. Without legal access to the creek that ran through his property, the land would become virtually worthless for cattle ranching. But more than that, the timing suggested careful planning by someone who knew exactly when he would be most vulnerable to such manipulation. "This is forgery," Eli said, but even as he spoke the words, he realized how difficult that would be to prove. The signature was close enough to his own handwriting to fool casual inspection, and the supporting documentation appeared professionally prepared. Maeve had continued examining the file, and now pulled out additional papers that painted an even more disturbing picture. "There are more documents here," she said grimly. "Surveys, assessments, correspondence between Lone Star and various government offices. This appears to be part of a systematic campaign to acquire land throughout the region." As they spread the papers across the desk, a pattern emerged that revealed the scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. Lone Star Land Development had been quietly acquiring water rights, mineral rights, and key parcels of land from ranchers throughout central Texas. The methods varied. Some properties had been purchased legitimately from desperate owners. Others had been acquired through legal manipulation, and still others through outright fraud. "Look at this list of properties," Maeve said, pointing to a document that catalogued Lone Star's holdings. "The Henderson Ranch, the Morrison Spread, even the old Patterson place that's been abandoned for years. They're assembling a massive holding that would control water access for hundreds of square miles." Eli recognized most of the names on the list. Neighbors who had sold out and moved away, often citing rustling losses and financial pressures as reasons for abandoning ranching. What he had assumed were separate decisions by individual families now appeared to be part of a coordinated campaign to force traditional ranchers off their land. "The rustling," he said slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. What if it wasn't random crime but part of this scheme? Drive down profits, create financial pressure, make ranchers desperate enough to sell cheap or vulnerable enough to fraud. Maeve nodded grimly, and anyone who resisted too effectively would find themselves facing legal challenges based on forged documents. By the time they could prove fraud in court, they would have spent their remaining resources on lawyers and lost their land anyway. The discovery explained why their coordinated anti-rustling efforts had been so successful. The thieves had simply moved on to easier targets rather than risk exposure of the larger operation. But it also revealed why success had felt hollow. They had been fighting symptoms while the real disease continued to spread unchecked. "We need to take this to the authorities," Maeve said, but even as she spoke, she was examining another document that made her expression grow even more grim. "Oh dear, Mr. Mercer, look at this correspondence." The letter she handed him bore the letterhead of the county clerk's office and was signed by Harold Brennan, the official responsible for recording property transfers. The casual tone of the correspondence suggested a comfortable working relationship between Brennan and Lone Star's representatives, including references to "our usual arrangements" and expedited processing fees. "The county clerk is involved," Eli said, the full scope of their situation finally becoming clear. "No wonder these documents passed official scrutiny. The corruption goes right into the local government." Additional papers revealed the involvement of other officials: the notary who had supposedly witnessed Eli's signature, the surveyor who had certified property boundaries, even the bank president who had approved loans secured by fraudulent deeds. What they had uncovered was not simply a case of criminal activity, but a systematic corruption of the legal and financial institutions that were supposed to protect property owners. "This explains why Sheriff Hawkins was so ineffective," Maeve observed. "He may not be actively involved, but he's certainly been kept ignorant of the true scope of what's happening." The immediate question was what to do with their discovery. Approaching local authorities was clearly pointless, since many of them appeared to be compromised. but taking their evidence to territorial or federal officials would require time they might not have, especially if Lone Star realized their fraud had been discovered. "Look at this," Maeve said, pointing to a letter dated just 2 weeks earlier. "They're planning to file a lawsuit to enforce their water rights claim. Once they do that, you'll be legally prohibited from using your own creek while the case works its way through the courts." The timeline was brutally clear. Lone Star intended to use their forged documents to drive Eli off his land through legal means, avoiding the messiness of continued rustling while achieving the same ultimate goal. And with corrupt local officials supporting their claims, the legal system that should have protected property rights would instead be used to facilitate theft. "There's something else," Maeve said quietly, examining a document that appeared to be an internal Lone Star memorandum. "According to this, the Mercer Ranch is considered a priority acquisition because of its strategic location. Control of your water rights would give them leverage over several other properties in the area." The memo revealed that Eli's stubborn resistance to selling had made him a particular target for the organization's more aggressive tactics. His isolation and financial struggles had marked him as vulnerable, while his strategic location made his property essential to their larger plans. "They're not just stealing individual ranches," Eli realized. "They're trying to control the entire regional water supply. Once they own enough water rights, they can dictate terms to any remaining ranchers." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but so was the danger they now faced. Lone Star had invested significant resources in their fraud and would not tolerate exposure of their methods. Eli and Maeve had stumbled upon evidence that could destroy a multi-county criminal enterprise, but they were isolated individuals facing an organization with vast resources and official protection. "We need help," Maeve said simply. "This is too big for us to handle alone." But as they looked through the papers scattered across the desk, both realized that their options were severely limited. Local authorities could not be trusted, distant officials might not act quickly enough, and they had no way of knowing how far the corruption extended. The forged deed lay between them, a symbol of how completely the legal system had been turned against the people it was supposed to protect. For the first time since Maeve's arrival, Eli felt the weight of despair returning, the sense that forces beyond his control were determining his fate. But this time, he was not facing the crisis alone. Maeve's presence beside him, her intelligent analysis of their situation, and her unwavering determination to find solutions reminded him that even the most overwhelming problems could be addressed by people willing to work together. "We'll figure this out," he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Somehow, we'll find a way to fight this." Maeve's smile carried both affection and fierce determination. "Yes," she agreed, "we will." The decision to fight Lone Star land development required courage that Eli had not summoned since the war, but it also demanded strategic thinking that drew on every lesson Maeve had learned about navigating complex institutions. Over the following week, they developed a plan that would require perfect timing, absolute trust, and the kind of community cooperation that Eli had spent 15 years avoiding. "We can't go through normal channels," Maeve explained as she outlined their strategy, "but we can use their own methods against them. If they're relying on corrupt local officials, we need to find honest authorities with jurisdiction over those officials." The key insight came from Maeve's teaching background and her familiarity with government bureaucracy. Federal marshals had authority over local corruption, territorial officials could override county decisions, and newspaper editors in distant cities might be interested in exposing systematic fraud that extended across multiple counties. But building their case required evidence that went beyond the documents they had discovered. They needed testimony from other victims, proof of the officials' involvement, and documentation that would convince skeptical authorities that the conspiracy was real and extensive. "Frank Henderson needs to know what we've found," Eli said. "If his water rights were stolen the same way mine were, he'll want to help expose these people." The meeting with Henderson and other neighboring ranchers revealed the full scope of Lone Star's operations. Nearly every family in the region had been affected, either driven off their land entirely or pressured into selling valuable rights for far less than their actual worth. But fear of legal retaliation had kept most victims silent, creating the isolation that made individual resistance ineffective. They told me the sale was legal. Henderson admitted when shown the pattern of forged documents. Had all the right stamps and signatures. By the time I realized what I'd lost, they said it was too late to reverse the transaction. Similar stories emerged from other ranchers who had remained in the area despite losing crucial water or mineral rights. The systematic nature of the fraud became clear as families shared experiences they had previously kept private out of shame or fear. "We need to coordinate our response," Maeve insisted. "Individual complaints will be dismissed as sour grapes from failed ranchers, but a group of property owners presenting evidence of systematic fraud will be much harder to ignore." The challenge was organizing people who had learned to distrust institutions and rely only on themselves. Eli found himself in the unfamiliar position of asking neighbors for help while simultaneously offering to lead a fight that would put all of them at risk. "I'm not asking you to follow me into anything I wouldn't do myself," he told the group assembled in his parlor. "But I am asking you to trust that we're stronger together than we are apart." The words came easier than he had expected, as if Maeve's influence had gradually restored his ability to connect with other people. The isolation that had seemed like strength after Thomas's death now revealed itself as the weakness that had made him vulnerable to predators. Over the following days, evidence accumulated that painted a damning picture of corruption and fraud. Testimony from victims, documentation of suspicious transactions, and proof of officials' involvement created a case that even sympathetic authorities would find difficult to ignore. But building the case also increased their danger. Lone Star's representatives had begun making inquiries about unusual activity among local ranchers, suggesting they were aware that their operations faced potential exposure. Time was running short before the conspiracy would either be exposed or its organizers would take steps to silence their opposition. "They're planning something," Jake Morrison reported after a trip to town for supplies. "Strangers asking questions about who's been meeting at the ranch, how long Mrs. Callahan's been staying here, whether you've been in contact with territorial officials." The surveillance confirmed what Eli and Maeve had suspected. Their investigation had been discovered, and Lone Star was preparing countermeasures. The question was whether they could complete their case and get it to honest authorities before their enemies acted to stop them. It was during this tense period that Eli made a decision that surprised even himself. Reaching into the trunk where he had stored his most precious possessions, he withdrew his father's pocket watch, a family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of Mercer men. "This belonged to my grandfather," he told Maeve, holding the worn silver timepiece in hands that shook slightly with emotion. "He carried it through the Mexican War, passed it to my father, who carried it through the Indian campaigns. Dad gave it to me when I enlisted, and I carried it through 4 years of fighting." The watch had been intended for Thomas, another link in the chain of family legacy that connected past to future through shared symbols of continuity and courage. Eli had been unable to look at it since his son's death, but now he found himself drawing strength from its familiar weight. "I gave it to Thomas on his 8th birthday," Eli continued. "Told him it would be his when he was old enough to understand what it represented. After he died, I couldn't bear to see it, but I couldn't bear to get rid of it either." Maeve understood the significance of his sharing this memory. The pocket watch represented everything Eli had fought to preserve: family heritage, continuity across generations, the belief that some things were worth defending, regardless of personal cost. "What would Thomas want you to do now?" she asked gently. The answer came without hesitation. "Fight. He'd want me to fight for what's right, not just for what's mine." That evening, as they made final preparations for their confrontation with Lone Star and their corrupt allies, Eli played his fiddle with a passion that had been absent since before Thomas's death. The music that filled the ranch house carried themes of loss and recovery, of battles fought and won, of hope emerging from despair. "You know this might not end well," Eli said during a pause between songs. "These people have resources, connections, and no scruples about using violence to protect their interests." "I know," Maeve replied simply, "but some things are worth the risk. This ranch, this community, the principle that people shouldn't be able to steal what others have worked their entire lives to build." Her words carried echoes of the conversation that had brought them together months earlier, when a displaced schoolteacher and a desperate rancher had struck a bargain that neither fully understood. Now, facing a challenge that threatened everything they had built together, they discovered that their partnership had become something far more precious than either had dared hope. "Mrs. Callahan," Eli said formally, using the title that had marked their relationship from the beginning, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens tomorrow, these months have been the best I've known since Thomas died. You've given me back music, purpose, and hope." "Mr. Mercer," Maeve replied with equal formality, "you've given me a home when I thought I would spend my remaining years as a stranger in other people's houses. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The exchange carried weight beyond words, an acknowledgement of feelings that had grown despite their efforts to maintain proper boundaries. Both recognized that tomorrow's confrontation would determine not just the fate of the ranch, but the future of their relationship. Outside, the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the lengthening days and the subtle green tinge of grass that had survived the winter drought. The season that was supposed to mark the end of Maeve's employment was arriving, but neither she nor Eli spoke of departures or endings. Instead, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down, while making mental preparations for a battle that would require every ounce of courage and wisdom they possessed. The pocket watch ticked steadily on the mantel, marking time that seemed both precious and fleeting as they faced an uncertain future with the quiet confidence of people who had found something worth defending. Tomorrow would bring their confrontation with forces that threatened to destroy everything they valued. But tonight, they had each other, and that was enough to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The town hall meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a crisp March afternoon. But by noon, the building was already crowded with ranchers, townspeople, and curious onlookers, drawn by rumors of dramatic revelations about local corruption. Eli and Maeve arrived early, carrying a leather satchel filled with the evidence they had so carefully assembled over the past weeks. Harold Brennan, the county clerk whose correspondence had revealed his involvement in Lone Star's schemes, presided over the meeting with the nervous confidence of a man who believed his official position would protect him from any serious challenge. Beside him sat Mayor Crawford, Judge Hamilton, and other local officials whose expressions suggested they viewed this gathering as an annoying formality rather than a genuine threat to their arrangements. "This meeting has been called to address certain allegations that have been circulating regarding property transactions in our county," Brennan announced, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of someone accustomed to controlling such proceedings. "I want to assure everyone that all property transfers have been conducted according to established legal procedures." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people recognized the inadequacy of this opening statement. Frank Henderson had spread word about the meeting throughout the ranching community, and the room contained dozens of families who had been affected by Lone Star's operations. Eli stood slowly, his injured leg requiring careful attention as he rose to address the assembly. The sight of him preparing to speak created expectant silence. Most people present knew him by reputation, but had rarely heard him participate in community discussions. "Mr. Brennan," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I'd like to present some information that might interest this gathering." "The floor recognizes Mr. Mercer," Brennan replied, though his expression suggested he would prefer to recognize almost anyone else. Maeve stood beside Eli, her presence providing silent support as he began laying out their case. From the leather satchel, he withdrew the forged deed that had started their investigation, holding it high enough for the entire assembly to see. "This document claims that I sold my water rights to Lone Star Land Development 18 months ago," Eli announced. "The signature appears to be mine, The notarization looks official, and the filing was accepted by the county clerk's office. But I never signed this document, never agreed to any such sale, and never received the $5,000 it claims I was paid. The accusation sent a visible shock through the room. Property fraud was serious business in a community where land ownership represented the foundation of economic survival. But more shocking was the implication that local officials had facilitated such fraud. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Mercer," Judge Hamilton interjected, his judicial robes lending authority to his skeptical tone. "Do you have proof that this document was forged?" Maeve stepped forward, her teaching background evident in the calm, methodical way she addressed the question. "Your Honor, we have evidence that goes far beyond this single document. May I present our findings to the Assembly?" At the judge's grudging nod, Maeve began laying out their case with the systematic approach of someone accustomed to presenting complex information to diverse audiences. She displayed additional forged documents, correspondence revealing official involvement, and testimony from other victims who had remained silent until now. "The pattern is clear," she explained, her voice carrying the authority of careful research and logical analysis. Lone Star Land Development has been systematically acquiring property throughout this region through a combination of fraud, coercion, and corruption of local officials. As she spoke, other ranchers began standing to corroborate her testimony. Frank Henderson confirmed that his water rights had been purchased through similar suspicious documentation. The widow Patterson admitted that pressure from mysterious creditors had forced her to sell mineral rights she had never intended to part with. Family after family stepped forward with stories that painted a devastating picture of coordinated theft disguised as legitimate business. But the most damning moment came when Maeve produced the correspondence between Harold Brennan and Lone Star representatives. Reading selected excerpts aloud, she revealed the casual nature of their conspiracy and the financial arrangements that had motivated official cooperation. "These letters discuss expedited processing fees and our usual arrangements," Maeve said, her voice remaining steady despite the explosive nature of her revelations. They reference specific documents by number and include instructions for avoiding normal oversight procedures. The effect on the assembled crowd was electric. Angry murmurs grew into outright shouting as people realized the extent to which they had been betrayed by officials they had elected to protect their interests. Brennan's face had gone pale, while other implicated officials began exchanging worried glances. "These allegations are preposterous," Mayor Crawford declared, rising to his feet with the bluster of a man hoping volume could substitute for credibility. Mr. Mercer and his associateer, obviously trying to create controversy where none exists. Their so-called evidence could have been fabricated by anyone with access to official letterhead. But even as he spoke, Crawford's protests were undermined by the arrival of unexpected reinforcements for Eli and Maeve's position. Federal Marshal William Torres entered the hall accompanied by two deputies, their presence transforming the atmosphere from heated discussion to serious legal proceeding. "Marshal Torres," Judge Hamilton said, clearly surprised by this development, "we weren't expecting federal involvement in what is essentially a local property dispute." "Your Honor," Marshal Torres replied with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with corruption at every level, "we've been investigating reports of systematic fraud affecting multiple counties in this territory. The evidence presented here today confirms much of what our investigation has already uncovered." The marshal's words sent a chill through the officials who had assumed their local connections would protect them from serious consequences. Federal jurisdiction meant that their corrupt arrangements with county and territorial authorities would provide no shelter from prosecution. Maeve reached into her bag and withdrew her most precious weapon in this confrontation, an old hymnal that had belonged to her grandmother. As tension in the room reached a breaking point, she opened the worn book and began singing in a clear, strong voice that commanded attention through its very unexpectedness. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The familiar hymn had an immediate calming effect on the crowd, its message of redemption and hope, offering an alternative to the anger and recrimination that had been building. One by one, other voices joined hers, until the entire hall resonated with the sound of a community remembering its better angels. When the song ended, the atmosphere had transformed from confrontational to reflective. Marshal Torres stepped forward to address the assembly with renewed authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what we've heard today represents just the beginning of a comprehensive investigation into corruption that has affected communities throughout this territory. Justice will be served, but it will require continued cooperation from honest citizens willing to stand up for what's right." The first phase of their battle was won, but Eli and Maeve both knew that true victory would require sustained effort to ensure that those responsible faced meaningful consequences for their crimes. The weeks following the town hall meeting brought a whirlwind of activity that transformed the sleepy county into the center of a territorial investigation. Federal marshals established a temporary headquarters in the hotel, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence, while corrupt officials either fled or hired expensive lawyers from San Antonio. The breakthrough came when Marshal Torres discovered the original land grant in the county courthouse Volta document that had been deliberately misfiled to support Lone Star's fraudulent claims. The authentic papers, bearing official territorial seals and dated 25 years earlier, proved conclusively that Eli held legitimate title to his water rights and that the forged deed was worthless. "This document settles the immediate question of your property rights," Torres explained to Eli and Maeve during a meeting in the ranch office. "But more importantly, it provides the evidence we need to unravel the entire conspiracy." The original land grant had been hidden among misfiled documents in a storage room that Harold Brennan claimed was rarely accessed. But a careful examination revealed that the filing system had been deliberately manipulated, with authentic documents moved or destroyed to create space for fraudulent replacements. Brennan kept detailed records of his criminal activities, Torres continued, displaying ledgers that had been seized from the clerk's office. He documented every bribe, every forged document, every illegal transaction. The man apparently believed his official position made him untouchable. The marshal's evidence revealed the staggering scope of Lone Star's operations. Over 3 years, they had acquired control of water rights, covering nearly 200 square miles, mineral rights to valuable deposits throughout the region, and outright ownership of dozens of properties obtained through fraud or coercion. The total value of stolen property exceeds $500,000, Torres explained. This wasn't opportunistic crime, but systematic theft on a scale that threatened the entire economic foundation of the region. But even more shocking was the discovery of Lone Star's ultimate plans for their accumulated holdings. Documents seized from their offices revealed intentions to sell the entire package to a railroad company planning to extend lines through central Texas. The conspiracy had been designed not just to steal individual properties, but to consolidate control of strategic land that would become exponentially more valuable once rail connections were established. "They knew about the railroad plans months before anyone else," Maeve observed, studying maps that showed the correlation between stolen properties and planned rail routes. Someone with inside knowledge was feeding them information about which land would become most valuable. The revelation led to arrests that reached into the territorial capital, exposing corruption that extended far beyond the local officials who had seemed like the primary villains. Railroad executives, territorial appointees, and prominent businessmen found themselves facing federal charges as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. For Eli, vindication came with the formal restoration of his property rights and the arrest of those who had tried to steal his legacy. But more meaningful was the transformation of his relationship with the community he had isolated himself from for so many years. "You did something that none of us had the courage to do alone," Frank Henderson told him during a gathering at the ranch to celebrate their victory. "You stood up to people who seemed too powerful to fight." The comment reflected a broader recognition that Eli's willingness to risk everything in defense of principle had inspired others to find their own courage. The coordinated response that had exposed the conspiracy represented the kind of community cooperation that could address challenges too large for individual resistance. "It wasn't courage," Eli replied honestly. "It was desperation combined with the good sense to accept help when it was offered." His acknowledgement of Maeve's crucial role in their success prompted knowing smiles from the assembled neighbors. Everyone present had observed the partnership that had developed between the formerly reclusive rancher and the displaced schoolteacher, and most had drawn their own conclusions about the nature of their relationship. As spring advanced toward summer, the legal proceedings continued with guilty pleas, convictions, and restitution orders that would restore stolen property to its rightful owners. But for Eli and Maeve, the most important resolution involved not legal documents but personal decisions about their future together. The seasonal deadline that had originally defined Maeve's employment had passed without discussion, her presence having become so integral to the ranch's operation that departure seemed unthinkable. Yet neither had spoken directly about the permanent arrangements that their mutual dependence seemed to require. The conversation that resolved their uncertainty came on a warm evening in April, as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set over land that was safely theirs once again. The fiddle lay across Eli's lap, temporarily silent as they enjoyed the peaceful conclusion to a day of productive work. "Mrs. Callahan," Eli said, using the formal address that had marked their relationship from the beginning, "I believe our original agreement has been fulfilled. Your work setting the account straight and teaching the men to read has been completed successfully." "Indeed it has, Mr. Mercer," Maeve replied with equal formality. "The question now is what comes next for both of us." The exchange carried undercurrents of deeper meaning that both recognized, but neither was quite ready to address directly. Their professional partnership had evolved into something that resembled marriage in everything but name. But the transition from practical arrangement to romantic commitment required acknowledgement of feelings they had been careful not to examine too closely. "I find myself reluctant to see you go," Eli admitted, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone taking an emotional risk. "Not just because of your practical contributions, but because this place feels like home again when you're here." "And I find myself reluctant to leave," Maeve replied, her words equally careful and equally meaningful. "Not just because I've grown fond of the work, but because I've grown fond of the man I've been working with." The admission hung between them, honest and direct, but still wrapped in the careful courtesy that had characterized their relationship. Both recognized that they were approaching a moment of decision that would define the rest of their lives. 6 months later, on a golden October afternoon that painted the Texas landscape in shades of amber and rust, the Mercer Ranch hosted a wedding that brought together the entire community in celebration of second chances and late-blooming love. Maeve stood in the parlor that had been transformed for the occasion, wearing a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her silver hair and brought out the gray of her eyes. The simple gold band that Eli had placed on her finger moments earlier caught the afternoon light streaming through windows that now sparkled with the attention of a woman who understood that a home required more than mere shelter. "Mrs. Mercer," Eli said, testing the new name with obvious pleasure. The wedding ring on his own, finger-worn and comfortable, as if it had always belonged, there represented not a compromise with loneliness, but a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and deepening affection. The ceremony had been conducted by Circuit Reverend McKenna, whose monthly visits to the region had made him a familiar figure to families scattered across the vast landscape. His words about love finding its own timeline had resonated with a congregation that understood how life's unexpected turns could lead to blessings that arrived precisely when they were needed most. Frank Henderson served as best man, his presence symbolizing the community connections that Eli had rediscovered through his relationship with Maeve. The ranch hands Jake, Cookie, Pete, and Tom occupied the front row, with the pride of men who had witnessed their boss's transformation from bitter isolation to renewed engagement with life. But the most meaningful presence was that of neighbors and friends who had become family through shared struggle against the forces that had threatened their way of life. The fight against Lone Star's conspiracy had forged bonds that extended far beyond mere geographical proximity, creating the kind of community that could sustain individuals through whatever challenges the future might bring. The reception, held on the front lawn under cottonwood trees that Thomas had once planned to climb, featured Cookie's best attempts at refined cooking, supplemented by contributions from every family in the county. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes that represented the cultural diversity of the region: German sausages, Mexican tamales, southern cornbread, and Scandinavian pastries brought by settlers who had carried their traditions across vast distances to build new lives in Texas. As evening approached and the celebration took on the warm glow of lanterns strung between trees, Eli retrieved his fiddle for the first time since their wedding ceremony began. The music that emerged was different from the melancholy tunes that had marked his solitary years livelier, more hopeful, infused with the joy of a man who had rediscovered reasons to celebrate. "Play The Water Is Wide," Maeve requested, referring to the song that had marked the beginning of his return to music months earlier. But instead of the mournful ballad, Eli launched into a spirited rendition of Buffalo Gals, inspiring couples to form dancing sets on the improvised dance floor that the ranch hands had constructed from wooden planks. The sight of his neighbors enjoying themselves on his land, celebrating his happiness, fulfilled dreams that Eli had buried along with his son so many years before. Maeve moved through the celebration with the grace of someone who had found her proper place in the world. The displaced schoolteacher, who had arrived in response to a mail-order advertisement, had become the heart of a community that valued her intelligence, respected her courage, and appreciated her ability to inspire the best in others. "You've given him back his music," Jake Morrison observed, joining her near the refreshment table as Eli continued playing with enthusiasm that showed no signs of flagging. "Haven't seen him this happy since before Thomas died." "He gave me back my purpose," Maeve replied, watching her new husband with obvious affection. "I thought my useful years were behind me, that the best I could hope for was comfortable obscurity. Instead, I found meaningful work and unexpected love." The exchange reflected the mutual transformation that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Neither had sought romance when desperate circumstances brought them together, but their partnership had evolved into something deeper than either had thought possible at their age. As the evening progressed and younger guests began the long journey back to their own ranches, Eli and Maeve found themselves surrounded by the core group of family and friends who had witnessed their journey from tentative cooperation to genuine partnership. The conversation turned to plans for the coming year: improvements to the ranch, expansion of the literacy program for hired hands, and the possibility of establishing a school that would serve children throughout the region. "Education is the foundation of everything else," Maeve explained to the assembled group. "Children who can read and write and calculate will build a stronger community than those who must rely only on physical labor." Her vision for the region's future reflected the same practical idealism that had enabled her to see possibilities where others saw only problems. The conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the traditional ranching community had been defeated, but the real victory lay in building something better than what had existed before. "Thomas would have loved this," Eli said quietly, his words carrying not sorrow but gratitude for the opportunity to honor his son's memory through positive action. "He always said the ranch should be a place where families could thrive, not just survive." The wooden toy horse, now displayed prominently on the mantel inside the house, had become a symbol of continuity rather than loss. Beside it sat the pressed wildflower that Maeve had preserved, representing the beauty that could survive even the harshest conditions when properly tended. As the last guest departed and Eli and Maeve prepared to begin their first night as husband and wife, both reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them together. The mail-order bride advertisement that had seemed like desperate folly had instead provided the catalyst for a transformation that neither could have imagined. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Rebecca had actually arrived instead of me? Maeve asked as they stood together on the front porch, looking out over land that now represented shared dreams rather than lonely memories. I try not to think about what might have been, Eli replied, echoing words he had spoken months earlier. But I'm grateful that whatever forces shape our lives brought me exactly what I needed, even though I was too stubborn to realize it at the time. Their wedding rings caught the starlight, simple bands that represented complex truths about love's ability to bloom in unexpected seasons. The Mercer Ranch, once a monument to isolation and grief, had become a testament to the possibility of renewal and the power of partnership to transform both individuals and communities. Inside the house, the fiddle rested in its place of honor, ready to provide music for whatever celebrations and sorrows the future might bring. The accounts were balanced, the legal troubles resolved, and the community strengthened by shared struggle and mutual support. But more than that, two people who had thought their chances for happiness were behind them had discovered that love, like hope, could push through even the most parched ground when the conditions were finally right for growth. As they prepared for sleep in the home that had once echoed with loneliness but now resonated with contentment, Eli and Maeve looked forward to whatever adventures their remaining years might hold. They had found in each other not just companionship but partnership, not just affection but deep and abiding love. The drought that had threatened to destroy everything they valued had finally broken, and the first green shoots of new grass were beginning to appear across the landscape. Like their own late-blooming romance, the return of life to the land promised that renewal was always possible for those with patience to wait and wisdom to recognize opportunity when it finally arrived. The story that had begun with a desperate gamble and a fortunate mistake had become a testament to the truth that love, like grass after rain, could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances when tended by hearts brave enough to remain open to unexpected blessings.